Hey, everybody. Happy Sunday. So, this is actually the second Sunday of 2023. And one of my goals for the new year, let me just straighten out my camera for YouTube. One of my goals for the new year is to go live each Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. So, if you're on Central Time like me, it's 2 p.m. And that way I can help students prepare for the exam, answer any questions that you have, things like that. So I'm really excited to just kind of help you prepare for the exam. So if you're just joining, go ahead and leave a question or a comment in the chat. Let me know what questions you have about AP Lang. It could be anything from like multiple choice to rhetorical analysis, synthesis, argument. Any questions you have about what the exam is like or how to do something, let me know. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. All right. And so while I'm waiting for questions on both TikTok and YouTube, I'm just going to start giving y'all some tips about the AP Lang exam because these are some things that I've been telling my students in class lately. And so I figured I would come live and let y'all know some tips as well. But if you have questions, please go ahead and leave them in the chat and I'd be happy to answer them. So, one of the things that I think students should be doing as we're preparing for the AP Lang exam is practicing essays. So, if you are working on essays in class, make sure you're applying your teacher's feedback and make sure you really understand the rubric. I think that's one of the biggest struggles. I know right now in my classes, we're talking a lot about commentary because that's one of the things that kind of makes or breaks your score. So while we're waiting for some questions and everything in the chat, I figured I would give you all a couple tips about commentary. And these tips are going to apply to any of the AP Lang essays. So, one quick tip for your commentary if you are struggling with your AP Lang essays is make sure that your commentary doesn't just restate what your quote says. Because a lot of times, what we see is when students are just beginning AP Lang, their commentary just kind of summarizes the evidence. And that's not really what commentary is, or at least it's not what it's supposed to be. So, commentary is supposed to be your analysis, your own original thoughts. So, here's some quick tips to do. One is really simple, just use the word because. So a lot of times what happens is students start to write their commentary and then they kind of cut it off and they need to write 2 or 3 more sentences of commentary if possible. So if you want to expand your AP Lang commentary, literally just write the word because and then keep asking yourself why, how, or so what. Even if it feels a little bit redundant, the more commentary you write, the better chances you are or you have of improving your score. Oh, you're in college watching this. Well, thank you for joining anyway. So, if y'all have questions about AP Lang, let me know. Feel free to, if you're on TikTok, hit your screen, give it some likes. I would greatly appreciate that. And if you're on YouTube, feel free to like the live stream as well. So, right now we're just talking about commentary because I know a lot of AP Lang students struggle with that. And so, I just said one quick tip is to use the word because. It seems really simple, but it genuinely helps. So, something else for all 3 essays, but it kind of differs depending on which essay you're talking about, is trying to situate the issue in a broader context. So, let me kind of explain what that means. For rhetorical analysis, one thing that you could do is kind of ask yourself specifically, why are they making this choice? And really connect it to the message, argument, or purpose. That's the goal of rhetorical analysis. One tip that I give my students for their conclusions, though, and not all my students write a conclusion. Like, honestly, conclusions are not necessary in AP Lang. They're nice, but if you don't have time, you don't have time. So, one thing I tell my students if they're trying to add a little bit more commentary or insight into their rhetorical analysis is to ask number one, what is the historical impact of the piece? Because some speeches lend themselves to that. Like some are about like famous events and things. And so you could, if you know the history of it, kind of talk about the influence that it's had since then. Something else that you could do is you could ask yourself, how is the message relevant today? So on last year's exam for rhetorical analysis, the prompt was a speech by Sonia Sotomayor, and it was about identity. And so one thing that you could do in your conclusion, if you have time, is you could think about the role that identity has today. Because she, in her speech, she referenced like the melting pot and the salad bowl. And so you could talk about how in the 9-ish years since she gave the speech, how the topic of identity has changed in American culture. That would be something I would say for the conclusion. But a lot of times students ask, like, what can I do if I want to write a conclusion and I don't want to just restate my thesis? So that would be one thing, is to ask yourself, how does this message relate to society today? So broader context there. You could also do it for synthesis and argument. So let's talk about synthesis first, because for synthesis, I think sometimes, at least lately, they've been offering a lot of prompts that are kind of education based. So last year it was about STEM technology or STEM classes. So 2 years ago it was about cursive writing. So the prompts have been more approachable, which is good. But for synthesis, one thing that you can do is, first of all, ask yourself why the issue is important. Whether it's an issue that you've thought about or heard of or not, but ask yourself why the issue is important and think about the societal impact. So, why is it going to be important in the short term? Like, how is this going to affect society right away? And then how is it going to affect society in the long term? And that could be commentary that you could put in your body paragraphs and or your conclusion. So really be thinking about like the big picture of the issue with synthesis, because sometimes the topics might not seem like they're a big deal, like, cursive writing, but at the same time, think about how handwriting is super important, yet we're moving toward a digital age. And so is cursive really necessary? I would venture to say not. And a lot of students took that stance in their essays. So that would be a broader context that would help with commentary as well. And it's really similar for argument. The difference is that argument, you don't have sources. So you do have a topic that you're supposed to be talking about, but you choose your own examples, which can be kind of easier for some people, but also kind of harder for others. So if you are just joining us on TikTok, do me a huge favor and hit the screen so it can give this some likes. And if you have any questions about AP Lang, either on YouTube or TikTok, feel free to ask. I'll do my best to answer them. It could be anything from like the essays to multiple choice. I have been going live. This is week 2. I'm going to be going live at this time each Sunday and just answering questions. And I know as the exam approaches, there will be a lot more questions, but I wanted to connect with students and answer questions that they might have leading up to the exam. And I'll be posting like more TikTok content. I'm trying to post like a couple videos a day. And on YouTube, I'm trying to post like 1 or 2 videos a week to prepare for the exam. So if you're an AP Lang student, then like feel free to ask questions. And we have some AP Bio representation in the chat. I wish I understood AP Bio better. My husband actually teaches biology, not AP though. So we have a little bit of science in our household as well. All right. So I was wondering, what is your best tip to get a 3 out of 6 on the essays? Okay, that's a great question, because a lot of teachers feel like a 4 out of 6 is the score that you want or higher. And I agree. If you look at the wording of the rubric, it seems like we want a 130 or higher. So if you're getting a 3 out of 6, that probably means you're getting a 120. I would say most students who get a 120, it's probably because of their commentary. I have found that the students where, like my own students, if I give them a 120, their evidence was probably fine, but it was probably their commentary that brought it down. So someone said you've popped up on my For You page. Okay, well, awesome. So for the, I'm wondering if that's one of my students. I don't recognize it. if it is, okay, that's awesome. So one of the things that happens with a 120 is it depends on the essay, but there's probably limited commentary. So if it's rhetorical analysis, my best advice for you in that regard is to make sure that you are connecting whatever choice you're talking about to the message, argument, or purpose. For rhetorical analysis, it's going to ask you about one of those 3 things. And remember that all passages have a purpose for rhetorical analysis. So if it asks you about message, you should still write about the message, which is like the lesson or the takeaway, but you can still talk about purpose. So that would be the biggest thing, is you need one of your choices to very thoroughly connect to message, argument, or purpose. Try it in all your paragraphs. Usually students have 2 or 3 body paragraphs, but you want to make sure that you're definitely connecting to message, argument, or purpose. That would be one of the best pieces of advice I'd have to improve your essay score if you're struggling with rhetorical analysis. The other thing to remember, and this is kind of something that I think some students can use to their advantage, is okay, technically, you can get a 130 by having a thesis and one really strong body paragraph. And so, what I told my students for the 2020 exam, because that was just rhetorical analysis because of COVID, is I told them, like, worst case scenario, write a really short intro, like a couple sentences in a thesis. That's usually what my students tend to do. Worst case scenario is just write a thesis. And then I said, if you're struggling, plan out your 2 body paragraphs. Most of my students just do 2, and choose which one is going to be like your home run paragraph. That's what we called it that year. And basically, like, give that paragraph everything you've got. And it did work. A couple students who had some really like frustrating experiences that year because of COVID and everything, they got the score that they were hoping for because their essay had like at least one strong paragraph. That year, as teachers, we actually got to see our students' essays. So that's how I know that that's what happened with the people that I'm talking about. But even in class, I've seen students where, as I'm looking at their work, I'm like, okay, this student has one really solid paragraph in rhetorical analysis where they have choices that like a choice, maybe 2 that they're talking about in this paragraph, because sometimes they're related. They've got specific evidence. Usually we want to see direct quotes, but a paraphrase is also okay. Short quotes, though, don't be taking like these full huge sentences because that really makes your writing slow down. And then the commentary really has to connect to message, argument, or purpose, and think about the rhetorical situation. So one of the things that I think, oh yeah, someone said that they liked, yeah, we liked having it. I liked getting it back too because I really like to see what students did. Now you can like, so in case people are curious, your teachers or your school, I guess, not your teachers, your school can ask for your exam booklets back. But unfortunately, like, we don't get to see your individual scores on the responses. We just know your composite. So in some cases it might be worth it, sometimes not. But I really liked getting to see the students essays, and because they only had to write one essay in 2020 because of everything, it was very clear, like, okay, this is their score, this was their work. We got to see exactly what was going on, which was kind of nice. For argument essays, are we allowed to use personal anecdotes as evidence? I was a bit confused. Yes, you are, but let me give you a couple tips for that, because there's times when it goes well and there's times when it kind of falls flat. So, yes, you can write about personal experience. In fact, some of the older prompts actually mention this. The newer prompts might as well, but I use the acronym CHORES. So, current events, history, outside knowledge, which is like sports, pop culture, all that kind of stuff, reading, experiences, and science. Other teachers use like Hugo and CHELPS. We have acronyms. They all mean the same thing or like very similar. So anyway, yes, you can write about personal experience. However, I would make sure that if you're going to write about personal experience, that it is something that is meaningful. So usually we want the experience to somehow show personal growth. That's going to really help. A lot of times when students write about personal experience for argument, it comes across as really trivial. So you want to make sure that it's an experience that you can kind of summarize quickly and also really examine the impact. So let me give you a couple of examples of what I've seen that works well and maybe that doesn't work well. One that works well, and you can find this sample online somewhere, it's for the exploring the unknown prompt. The student wrote about their experience with like a ropes course. And so it was detailed. They talked about the fear that they felt and how their parents kind of like made them do it. But then after they were done, and they were done with that like unknown, then they actually really liked ropes courses and continued to do it. So the value, I think, in that experience was, it was like the student was able to talk about an actual event that impacted their life. And that's where I think the personal experience can go well. If you're talking about something that seems kind of trivial, like I've read a lot of student essays because I grade, or not grade, but I score for our state mock exam that we do. And I'm also an AP reader. So in different scenarios, I've read a lot about like high school breakups or whatever, for whatever the prompt is. And those usually are kind of like, if it's the best example you could come up with in the moment, then fine. But they're kind of like, maybe that's not the best evidence. So choose something that you could write about in a meaningful way. It also doesn't have to be something you personally experienced. You can also write about somebody else's experience. So I have seen students write about like a brother, sister, father, mother, something like that, if the evidence fits. So yes, you can write about personal experience. All right. Let's see. You're welcome. But yeah, I do have a video on my YouTube channel about writing about personal experience. So if you want like it has some examples in it, like how you can write about like sports and things like that. And you can also connect personal experience to like an outside example. So like let's go with sports. Like if you are a sports enthusiast and you let's say you really like I don't know like soccer, but you also play soccer, you might be able to use an example from like a real world soccer player and your own personal experience. So if you type in I don't know if I have a blog post about it, but I know I have a video about it. If you type in like Coach Hall writes, writing about personal experience or something like that, the video should pop up. Side or the other? Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. There's a two-part comment. I was like, what? What is your opinion on teaching students to write a nuanced argument rather than just picking one side or the other? Oh, I don't think all students are ready for that. So some of my more advanced writers, I try to teach them, but as far as like qualifying their argument, but not everybody's ready for that. One thing that I kind of did in class that kind of helped students is we made a continuum. So like literally like a line with like two arrows on it. And I had them write their claim on like a sticky note and they had to put it on the continuum. And students were kind of realizing that they didn't have to be all the way over to like the yes or the no or whatever the breakdown was. But we just didn't want them dead center either because then they were probably going to equivocate. So on the argument essay, for students that are watching, we don't want you to argue both sides evenly. So yes, you can address the counter argument. That's absolutely fine. It's not required, but you can do it. But we don't want you to have like one paragraph in favor of it and one paragraph against it, whatever the topic may be, because then it like basically seems like you're arguing both sides. But yes, you can absolutely include a concession, but you don't always need one. No, I think that's actually kind of something that when the rubric switched a couple years ago, I think that was something that kind of got like misconstrued in a couple of cases. Is I think that people thought because you could possibly earn the sophistication point through a nuanced argument that you should automatically have a concession and refutation or counterclaim and rebuttal, or just somehow address the counter argument. And so I see a lot of students who do it, but it's not high enough quality to elevate their essay. You can write a counter argument thesis too. A lot of my students really like this, where it's kind of like, although this, and then they have like their position. I have some videos about thesis statements like that. A lot of my students like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they actually address the counter argument in their essay. And there's a few reasons why. One is timing. So sometimes they just literally don't have enough time. If you're worried about timing, I tend to recommend putting your counter argument last, because that way, if you don't get to it, you've at least proven your side. And so you've still written, hopefully, a good argument. A few years ago, I used to really like when I was writing essays with my students, because I try to do like one or two a year, I had this habit of like leading with my concession. And I realized like while that was helpful for my writing style, that was not realistic for everybody. So I tell my students now, like, you do not need to include a counterclaim and rebuttal if you can't. Definitely don't stress about including one. And then usually I'm seeing more students put it toward the end. That way, if they run out of time, they've still argued well. So that would be my recommendation there. I do think it's valuable for students to know how to do it. I teach AP Lang and college English. I teach a couple other things too, but my AP Lang students that go into college English or concurrent credit, they write a longer research paper. And so I require it in that, because I want them to know how to do it. But I don't necessarily expect them to do it in a 40-minute essay. So it is a valuable skill that students need, but I wouldn't expect it in every essay. Someone asked if Lang is harder than Lit. in my opinion, Lang is easier. And usually Lang is offered first. Our school used to offer Lit first before I started teaching Lang. And then like when we flipped it and offered Lang then Lit, we saw the scores go up and students were, I don't want to say happier, but like it flowed better. Um, because Lang is going to teach you how to write in response to nonfiction. So I think Lang is a very valuable class because a lot of students are not going to be English majors. In fact, I've been teaching 9 years. I don't think I've had any of my students actually become an English major. One girl was going to, and then she switched to poli sci. So most of my students go into like medical stuff, science, that kind of thing. And so they have said, Lang made me a better writer because I know how to argue. The synthesis paper is like a research paper. Even rhetorical analysis, I've had some students tell me that they had to do that in some college classes. But I think rhetorical analysis is just a valuable life skill. So I would say Lang is super important if you're trying to prepare for college level writing and you feel like it would be a good fit for you, go for it. Now, Lit is going to be very different. Lit's going to have poetry, short fiction, and novels. If you like that type of content, then absolutely go for it. But I think it's also important to talk to students that are currently in the class because everybody's teacher is different. Talk to your current teacher too, because they might have some insight. And then also, I just in general encourage students to look at concurrent credit opportunities because some schools do it very differently. Like our school, we have AP Lang and AP Lit, and then we offer a concurrent credit class, and they're totally separate things. But if students take the full year of concurrent credit, they can get up to 6 college credits. So kind of figure out what the best situation is at your school because there's a lot of variables. But I think if you do well in Lang, even though Lit is different, I don't think it's going to be a ton harder. I just think it's different. The thesis statements are a little bit different. They focus on different things. The only students that I would say of mine, they didn't say Lang was harder. I've had a couple students who are just diehard, like they love fiction, and they're like, I preferred Lit content over Lang. They liked that type of content better, but they didn't say it was harder. Like so, but I also know that some teachers teach differently, so I don't want to mislead you. Are there parenthetical citations enough for citing? For synthesis, yes. It's actually better to have the parenthetical than to say like according to source A at the beginning of your sentence. But yes, for synthesis, definitely have parenthetical citations. It's not required for rhetorical analysis. Okay, let me answer a couple questions from YouTube because I see a couple in the chat. But if you're on TikTok, please, sorry. If you're on TikTok, please keep asking the questions. Hit your screen to give the live some likes, and I will answer those as well. Got a little tongue-tied there for a second. Do you have any tips on elevating my MCQ grade from 35 out of 45 to 40 plus? Well, first of all, congratulations on 35 out of 45 because that's a good score. It really depends on what you're missing. So I would say, first of all, go if you can. If your teacher will let you look at what you missed, just like, first of all, look for trends. So is there anything in common about the questions that you're answering? If you took a test on, like there's some full length ones on AP Classroom, teachers have access to an answer key and it tells us which skills it is. And sometimes those mean very little to students. So if you're noticing that it's a certain skill, I would focus on that particular skill. If it's kind of like all over the place, because I've seen that happen too. I have my students do this. I have them when they take all 3 that are available on AP Classroom, but when they take them, I have them when we go over it, like look for trends. And sometimes students are like, oh, I'm really bad at like this type of question. But then other times they're like, yeah, I missed like one of all these different kinds. So in that case, I think it can be very valuable if you're able to know what the right answer is, go back to the test and like look through it and kind of figure out, okay, why did you choose the answer you did and why is the right answer right? Because sometimes that helps you just understand how the College Board puts the test together. So that would be my first thing, is look for trends because that is easier to study. And if there is no trend, then definitely see if you can look at your test and figure out the answers and figure out like, were you deciding between 2 questions? Because that's really common. As a lot of times students narrow it down to 2 answers and then they might choose the wrong one. So that kind of thing. And I would also say For a 35 out of 45, I do think that's a good score. But look at, were you missing more of the reading or the writing? Because if you missed like 7 on the reading, but only 3 on the writing, then you should focus on the reading type questions. If it's a 5 and 5 split, that's kind of tricky. All right. And then let's see. Do you have any tips for choosing answers on MCQ questions that ask about the passage as a whole? Okay. So I was actually just talking to my students about this week because we're prepping for the ACT and they ask very similar questions. Obviously it's going to be really important to know what the passage is about, like what the idea is. With the answer choices, sometimes a couple of the answer choices are going to be about like one part of the passage. So eliminate those. So like if the answer choice is only talking about something that's like the beginning or the end of the passage, but not the whole passage, immediately eliminate those. And also look at the nuance in wording, because this is where it gets frustrating, but sometimes it's like literally one word can make the answer right or wrong. So look at the verbs that are in the answer choice, if that might be it, or like look at the adjectives, because sometimes one word can throw off the answer by making it like more precise or more broad, something like that. But yeah, that would be my best tip for that, is just really looking at like the nuance of the answer choices. All right, let's see. Any other questions? I think I got everything on TikTok. Let me just scroll, make sure I didn't miss one. Okay, I talked about you don't always have to have a concession. They're nice to have, but honestly, I think especially on the exam, like when you've not seen the topic before, they're sometimes hard to come up with and execute well under pressure. Like that's the thing I'm always reminding myself as a teacher, is that, students only have 40 minutes and they've never seen these prompts before. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky. But yeah, any other questions about the exam, either on YouTube or TikTok? If you're watching on YouTube, do me a huge favor and hit that like button on your screen. And if you are watching on TikTok and you're getting good info, I would love it if you would tap your screen as well. You can actually like rapid tap it. I figured that out earlier when I was watching somebody else's live. So yeah, feel free to ask any questions that you have about AP Lang in the chat. We've just been talking about like argument essays and multiple choice and things like that. I will be going live weekly. So I'm going to try to do it at this time each week. So if you have a question, feel free to reach out. I'm also going to be offering some like online classes for students. I don't know exactly when yet. I'm still kind of planning them, but if you all have suggestions, if you're like, I would really like a class about this, let me know. Cause I did some last year. I did one about rhetorical analysis last year and one about argument last year. So if there's topics that you want either like a video on or like a class or something, let me know, because I'm planning out everything leading into the exam as well. So working on some new videos. So I will happily take video requests for anything AP Lang related. And if you're looking for old stuff on YouTube, I have playlists for each of the essay types and multiple choice. And most of that information is like still current. Some of the topics I am going to try to redo just because not necessarily that anything has changed about the tips that I gave, but like I like to do new content, since the more I teach, the more I learn as well. And on TikTok, once I get to, I think I have to get to 10K. I need like 900 more followers on TikTok, and then I can make playlists on TikTok, which will be super helpful because I try to do quick tips on TikTok. All right. So feel free to ask any remaining questions that you have about AP Lang. And while we're waiting for a couple more questions to come in, I'll just kind of offer some general tips about what y'all can be doing to prepare now, because that's usually one of the most common questions I get. So a lot of you might be also studying for the ACT or the SAT. And if you are, the good news is that you can kind of double dip and also prepare for AP Lang. So for the SAT and ACT, really focus on those nonfiction multiple choice passages, because those are going to be somewhat similar to AP Lang. And most of the questions will be similar. The difference is on AP Lang, they give you 5 answer choices. So you have A through E, not just 4, like on the SAT and the ACT. So if you're studying for the SAT, you're sort of also studying for AP Lang. And then for the writing questions on the AP Lang test, which are the last 3 passages, those are the ones that I like the best because they're like shorter questions or shorter passages, and they have fewer questions. Those are very similar to some of the ACT and SAT um, English grammar questions. So on the SAT, it's the writing and language test. On the ACT, they call it the English test. Not the ones where they're asking you about like commas and colons and semicolons, but the ones that have like a question stem. So when they ask you like, should the writer delete this sentence, yes or no? Or like, where should this be placed in the paragraph or something? Those are going to be like the AP Lang test. So you can actually study from for ACT, SAT, and AP Lang. So that's really helped. Once I found which skills I struggle with, how can I do specific practice on those skills? Okay, so that's a good question. That's going to depend on a couple things. If your teacher is willing to, they can assign you stuff independently on AP Classroom. So that would be something that I would ask your teacher is like if you have access to AP Classroom, because not everyone does, or not every school uses it the same way. But as a teacher, I know that I can take, like, if you told me, oh, I need help with like, let's say 3C, whatever that skill is, I could filter for questions like that. And I could either, as a teacher, make it into my lesson, or I could just assign it for you to practice. Something else that might help is there's a couple places that have a free practice test. Marco Learning does. They have like one free practice test that they put out there. I think you have to use your email to sign up. But theirs is pretty close to the real thing. Like I like the quality of their free practice test. So you could use that and maybe look at the questions on their free practice tests that are similar. If it's a skill that's also on the SAT or ACT, then you can definitely practice questions like that because the SAT it used to be 10 full official practice tests online. And I think they took like 2 or 3 of them away. But all the stuff online for SAT and like it's also, I think, on Khan Academy, or almost all of it is. So you could specifically focus on that type of question. And ACT has fewer official stuff out there. But you could look at those practice questions as well. I wish AP Lang had more free practice stuff out there. I personally do not recommend the AP Lang test books. I've tutored students that have bought them before being my tutoring student. And so we've gone over their multiple choice, like with those books, and their scores were lower than what they were on like an in-class assignment. And also when we were going over some of the questions, I was like, this is not how they would phrase it on that. So like no real shade to like the test book companies, but like I have not found one that I can like recommend wholeheartedly. It's a lot easier to practice the essays. A lot of the test books have good essay questions, but not necessarily good multiple choice questions. Yeah. So if you're just joining us, feel free to ask any questions you have about AP Lang. If we haven't met yet, my name is Coach Hall. I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas, and I am going live every Sunday until the exam in May at this time to answer student questions and teacher questions too. I know we have a couple of teachers that sometimes log in. And I also produce videos on YouTube and TikTok. I'm trying to get to 10K. I'm super close on both platforms. So if you don't follow, but you'd like to support, that would be awesome. But I basically try to make tutorial videos to help students, and I'll be putting together a lot of content between now and the exam. So if y'all have any like topic requests, if you're like, hey, I would love a video about this, let me know. I'm also going to be doing some like live classes that are not like this. They're not Q&A. They're going to be like an actual lesson. So once I have those planned, I will talk more about those. But I want to try to help as many students as possible, because sometimes there's a lot on the line. Like I know there's college credit, and the more AP tests that you take, and if you get the scores that you need, that could mean that you ultimately save money on college. And let's face it, like college is expensive. So not to like put the pressure on students at all, because I really don't think that an AP score, like it's nice when students get the score that they want, but an AP score does not define you. I've had students make like a 2 on the exam and they are thriving in college. So I think sometimes we put a little bit too much stock into these scores, but at the same time, I know they're super important. A video going through the actual multiple choice questions and strategies to approach them would be great. I will work on that. some of the questions are copyrighted, so I have to be super careful what I show, but I will look into how I can do that because I have had a request for that for a while. The reason why I haven't done it with actual questions is because I don't want to get in trouble for copyright. But you're absolutely right. That would be very, very helpful. I think the thing about multiple choice that is a little bit stressful is sometimes, like, because there's 5 answer choices, even if you can like eliminate 2 or 3, I think students a lot of times like second guess themselves. And so it can be really helpful to learn like, okay, this is why it's the right answer. Because I was always that student in high school. Like I would tell myself, like, okay, like just go with your gut, because that's what our teacher would say. And then I'd get it wrong. And then the next time I'd be like, oh, well, I went with my gut last time and it was wrong. So I'm going to change it this time. And then that would be wrong. So multiple choice can be really stressful. The good thing about multiple choice, though, is that because there are 45 questions and it's 45% of your composite, each multiple choice question is worth 1 point. And if you are better at the writing questions, a lot of my students love the writing questions compared to the reading. You can actually start answering those first, especially on the paper test. As long as you're working on multiple choice when you're supposed to be, you can read the passages in any order that you want to. And so I've had a couple students who last year they went and they just started at passage 3, which is like usually around question 23, 24. And they knew that they were better at the writing questions. So they started there because they wanted to make sure that they had plenty of time. And then they went to the reading comprehension. The other thing is, and this is like a very unofficial theory, but I've talked about this with a few teachers and they've noticed it too. Sometimes on standardized testing, when the passage is really hard, the questions are actually easier to answer. And sometimes when the passage is really easy, the questions are really hard. And you would think it wouldn't be that way, but I've seen it happen a few times where it was like, okay, this passage was super difficult. But then when we got to the questions, it was like, oh, okay, these are more straightforward. And then there's other times where it was like, okay, I love this passage. It's really easy to understand. But then you get to the questions, you're like, what are you asking? So that can be something to think about as well, is like on test day, don't linger on any like one particular question, because they're all worth 1 point. So whether it's easy or medium or hard, which is all relative, but like don't waste time on any one question. You can come back to it if you have time. The other thing is make sure that you actually bubble in something for every question, because there's no penalty for guessing. And this goes for the SAT and the ACT as well. There used to be a penalty on the SAT, but there isn't now. So you should answer every question, even if it's just a guess. Because if you get it right, then you get those points. So yeah, those are some multiple choice tips for AP Lang. I can go into like more detail if people want about multiple choice, but I think the best thing to know right now, if you're an AP Lang student, is if you're also studying for the SAT and ACT, that can really help. The SAT is also written by the college or produced by the College Board. I don't think the same people make both tests. I suppose maybe there's somebody on the committee that is on both. I don't know. But like the wording can be really similar for some of the things. So SAT passages are helpful. On the AP Lang test, it used to be that before they revamped it, there used to be like time periods, like you were kind of guaranteed passages from like certain time periods. But like they really haven't said that that's definitely a thing anymore. And you're only going to get 2 reading passages. So it's possible that one will be from like before 1900 and one after, but it's also possible that they're both going to be like, from the 1900s. So we don't really know. So I do think it's important for students to have practice with some of the older passages, like 17 and 1800s, and then also more contemporary stuff, because they used to have like time period requirements and now they haven't really said. And unfortunately, as teachers, we don't really get to see the multiple choice from the exam. We can see the stuff on AP Classroom though. What would be a good way to utilize AP Classroom videos and questions in class? That's a really good question. I think, okay, so I don't really use a lot of the videos in class, but I think it's definitely possible to have students kind of watch and take notes. And a couple of the Facebook groups, if you are a teacher, some people have posted like video questions. But as far as like the AP Classroom questions, I really do like the progress checks. Now, I know that the answers are available online, and I always just tell my students, like, look, I can't grade your progress check. Like, you could fail it, and I will put it in the grade book as a completion grade. So please have integrity and just, do it as needed. And I haven't really had any issues with that. And I like the progress checks because they're color coded. And I have found that my students who get like the really dark green, those are the students who, if they took it honestly at the end of the year, they usually get a 4 or a 5. My students who are in like the lighter green, maybe sometimes the yellow, if it's a progress check, they tend to be a 3 or a 4, And so I like the correlation I've seen with the progress checks and the real exam, but I just know that that there's a little bit of outside resources out there that students might use, which as teachers, we don't want them to. I like to use the 3 full-length practice tests on AP Classroom. Those are super helpful to my students. There's 3 tests. My students score the best on 1 and 3 for whatever reason. For the past like 2 years or maybe 3 years that we've used them, their scores always drop with test 2. And my students tell me it's because they hate one of the passages. Like they just took it and they were like, whatever the second passage was, like that passage was really tough for them. And I like to use AP Classroom if I look at their full length test and I notice that there's a type of question that they're struggling with. Then you can go in AP Classroom and filter for that question. So I've done that quite a lot where I've just kind of made my own quiz based on like, this is the question type that we need practice on. So that can be really helpful as well for AP Classroom. So I do like their questions. Some of the videos are good, but I don't make my students watch all of them. But yeah, feel free to ask more questions in the chat if you have them. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe if you aren't already. And if you're watching on TikTok, I would love it if you would tap the screen, give this some likes, and follow if you want more AP Lang tips. My goal is to go live each week and like definitely have more content as the exam approaches. So YouTube is going to be longer content. I have one video that I'm editing that is super long about like how to pass the exam. But I'm going to be trying to have like shorter, like 8 to 10 minute videos on YouTube, and then TikTok. And the maximum I can do right now is 3 minutes. So I try to do like shorter, quick answers over on TikTok as well, just to help students out. So yeah, if you are an AP Lang student and you're trying to prepare, you have several months, like it's only January, but I would maybe, if you're wanting multiple choice practice, work on SAT or ACT questions. If you haven't done a lot of writing in class, sometimes students do like to practice writing on their own. I think that's one of the hard parts about the class is getting to write an essay in 40 minutes. So that would be something that sometimes students like to do on their own. And I would say the best thing that you can be doing on your own right now is building your world knowledge. So, listening to like 1 or 2 podcasts a week, or like a TED Talk, or reading articles. I know a lot of teachers do current events, which can be really helpful. Because for the argument essay, especially, it's really important to have specific evidence. And a lot of times, the students who are clearly very informed about whether it's historical topics or current events, those essays tend to read better. So that's something that I have my students do. I try to make it very like self-paced. I let them choose their topics. But I have them research like a current event each week, or like they watch a TED Talk or a podcast. I tell my students to start with topics that they're already interested in. And that makes it more accessible, because there isn't, unfortunately, this magical list of like people or events that you should know about. We see a lot of the same people and events come up in different essays. So a lot of prompts, I see students writing about like Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King or Thomas Edison. I don't know if that was an Arkansas thing, because that's where I teach, but for a couple years ago for our like statewide mock exam, I probably read 100 essays, not kidding, where students wrote about Thomas Edison and the light bulb. So we got, for Exploring the Unknown, we saw a lot of essays about Columbus. But the thing is like the essays that scored well, it was because the student had like a deeper historical knowledge. Like they weren't just trying to remember what they had learned in like 4th grade. It was something that they had learned about like more recently, and they had more specific information. That's going to be the key to an argument essay, is to make sure that you have specifics, because a lot of times students really write like general answers. Like if they're talking about Rosa Parks and they're just like, oh, she refused to give up her bus seat. Like that's not really as specific as we want for the exam. But that also means that you can write about topics that interest you. I read an essay a few years ago for the overrated prompt where a student wrote about Russell Westbrook being overrated, and I am not like a professional basketball fan. And I knew nothing about this basketball player, but the student clearly did. And he, like, it was written kind of like a sports journalism article. Like, it was very clear, like, why this person felt that Russell Westbrook was overrated. And like, I was convinced by reading the end of it. I was like, okay, because like the student had really good points. And so they played it to their advantage and they scored well. I think it was a 5 out of 6, if I remember correctly. That was not for the AP reading. That was for something that we do in my state, where we look at like essays from students in other schools. But it was still a well-written one. I've had a couple of students write about like sports, and like they're very clearly knowledgeable about like certain sports, and so they write about it well. So for argument essays, really play to your strengths. A lot of my students who are in APUSH do well with coming up with historical examples. So you can actually use your knowledge from other classes to help with the argument essays as well. So if you're in like an American history class or world history class, like pay attention to like the famous people and the famous events that you're covering, because you can actually use those for argument essays as well. All right, so any final questions about AP Lang? If you're just joining us, I'm just answering general questions about AP Lang. Like, it could be anything, multiple choice, essays. I'm going to be going live weekly. So if you don't have a question today, but you think of something during the week, feel free to hop on next week. I'm going to be trying to go live at this time slot. So it's like starts at 3 p.m. approximately Eastern time. If you're like me and you're on Central time, it's 2 p.m. That way I can answer student questions. And if you ever like have a question or like a video request, feel free to reach out on YouTube or TikTok, and I would be happy to try to create that. What is the difference between SAT English and AP Lang multiple choice? Okay, so if you mean the SAT, like the writing and language, like are we talking about the reading comprehension, or are we talking about more like the grammar ones? Because there are a couple key differences, but you can use SAT questions to study for AP Lang. So if you're talking about like the writing and language section for the SAT, you're going to want to choose the questions, or like pay special attention to the questions that have what we call a question stem. So like it's probably about a third of the questions. The questions where there's no question above it and it's just like A, B, C, D, and like the answer choices might have like a colon and one might have a comma, stuff like that, or like the verbs are different. Those are not on the AP Lang test. The ones that are on the AP Lang test are going to be ones with transition words. So if the answer choices have words like therefore, however, conversely, definitely do those, because transition words are on the AP Lang test. It can also be a transition from one paragraph to the next. So if on the SAT it says something like which sentence, assuming that they're all true or something like that, would offer the best transition from the preceding paragraph, then that's the type of question you're looking for as well. Or sometimes they'll ask questions like the writer wants to add the following sentence. Should they do so? And then the answer choices are like yes and no. Or it'll say something like the writer wants to keep the following sentence, yes or no, or delete it, yes or no. So those are the ones on the SAT. If you're talking about like the English grammar stuff, those are the ones that are also on the AP Lang test, is stuff like that. The AP Lang test is not going to have you need to know how to use like a semicolon or a colon or a dash correctly. They might ask you about combining sentences effectively. So it might say like, which answer choice is the best, represents the best way to combine the sentences. And the SAT words it very similarly. So that would be fine. Okay, so for the reading, so the reading comprehension, if you're looking at the SAT, and you're trying to practice for AP Lang, and this goes for ACT as well, ignore the first passage. Usually the first passage will say literary narrative. Okay. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just that your passages on the AP Lang test are going to be nonfiction. And so it will help if you read, like, usually on the SAT, it's like, or the ACT, it's like the other passages, like not the first one that's fiction, but the other ones. Sometimes they'll do what I call a double passage, which means it's like passage A, passage B. I don't know that I've seen them do that on the AP Lang test. Now, I'm not saying that they definitely won't do it. I just haven't seen it. But we don't, as teachers, we don't have access to all the possible options. So, but I do think you should still do those because it's like extra practice. So for those on the SAT, it's going to ask you sometimes about like, what is the best evidence for question 2? So like question 2 will ask you a question, and the question 3 will be like, what's the best evidence for question 2? You don't need the evidence questions for AP Lang. Like it's not going to ask you what's the best evidence for the preceding question, but the other questions are going to be pretty accurate. So you're going to want to look at questions that deal with the passage as a whole. You're going to want to deal with questions that say something like, author's purpose, or like, what is the function of this paragraph? So a lot of times they ask you about like the first paragraph or the last paragraph, like what's the function of it? Or the purpose. And then also words and context are pretty popular. You usually get like 1 or 2 per passage. It kind of depends. Those are the ones where it's like, what does the word in line 56 mean? And for those, always read the surrounding sentences, not just the line that it's in. So if it says line 56, don't just read line 56. Read like the whole paragraph, because usually there's a context clue before, sometimes after, usually it's before, that helps you figure out the meaning of the word. So those are the ones for reading. Is like, it has to be a nonfiction passage. So for the ACT, they call it things like humanities, social sciences, natural sciences. Those are all fair game. And honestly, on the ACT, the questions align pretty similarly. My students take the ACT as our state test. So we've been doing a lot of work with that, but I also tutor students with the SAT. And so the one I can say that I tell them to kind of skip if they're not really worrying about it and they're trying to prepare for just AP Lang is those ones where it says like, what's the best evidence for the previous question? But overall, it's good exposure. It's good exposure to practice those questions. So yeah, that would be a way to help. And if you, to help study, if you are looking for SAT stuff, the College Board, it says like the SAT Suite, like SUITE, or Khan Academy also has stuff. I think they're the same ones as far as I can tell. And then the ACT has a couple tests that are, some are printable and some are online. If you're looking to study for those. For the AP Lang prep books, I know you said you've never found one that you could like wholeheartedly recommend. Yes. But is there one that you think would be better? I would have to double check. Cause there was one last year where I was like, but I don't want to say which one it is, because if they updated it this year, I don't want to say, don't do this one and have it actually be better. I will look. That'll be my homework for this week. If I find one that I like based on if I can preview it online, I will let y'all know. Because it's like, usually they update them every year, because I think marketing wise, that's a way for them to make more money too. So they could say like the 2023 edition or the 2022 edition. So I will look and see if there's one that I have found that I like. But if you're looking for just like a free practice test, Marco Learning has one. I want to say Albert.io had something, but I don't know if it was a practice test. I can look though, because Albert.io has some good stuff too. But I will look into test prep books in case people want recommendations. But like as a teacher, I try to make sure before I recommend anything that it aligns, because I don't want people to waste their money on a test prep book. And I also don't want you to have the added stress of like, if, not just the expense, but like if you're taking the questions and they don't line up well, I don't want you to feel badly about that. So I will look. But yeah, there's a lot of, if you're looking for like essay questions, the College Board does post previous exam questions. I think that's what they call it on their website too. So you can look for previous exams if you're looking for like essay practice. If you are, stick to stuff that happened pretty currently, because some of the older prompts are absolutely fine. I still use some of the older prompts, but in case you aren't aware, the College Board changed their rubric so they announced it in 2019, but we didn't really start using it until 2020. But that exam was kind of odd because it was the COVID year. So the first full time that they used it was the 2021 exam. So they've used it twice. They've used it 2 years ago and last year. And then this year, obviously they'll use it. So there are fewer resources out there with like the new exam. But if you're trying to figure out like your essay scores, they do have stuff online. I'm not like sharing any secrets. It's like publicly accessible. But they have like sample essays that you can look at. And I use those with my students because I find them very helpful to kind of see like, um, what the College Board means when the rubric says like this or that. So that would be something to consider as well. If you're looking for like essay help, they do have some online. So yeah. All right. Any other final questions about AP Lang? If not, then I'll sign off for this week and I'll be back next week at the same time. So 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central. How many choices should be included in the rhetoric essay? So you're going to want at least two um, in your thesis and in your essay. Some students do three. Here's the thing is sometimes like students might put two per paragraph if they're kind of related. And here's what I mean by that. Like if you're analyzing, let's say like repetition, but you're also examining the word that's being repeated and why they repeated that word, then you're kind of analyzing both repetition and word choice or maybe tone and that kind of thing. So in your thesis, most students will usually put like 2 to 3 because you have to analyze, according to the rubric, you have to analyze multiple appeals or sorry, multiple choices and make multiple claims. So that would mean like 2 body paragraphs usually. Can you make 2 claims in the same paragraph? Yes, but we don't really want to like split hairs over that. Try for at least 2 body paragraphs. So I would say the other thing is with the choices, it really helps if you analyze chronologically. So if you look at like beginning, middle, end, or like first half, second half, so ask yourself, okay, what are they doing in the first half? And then what are they doing in the second half? Or what are they doing in the beginning, middle, and end? And those are your choices. But I would figure out like what's your main choice that you're going to talk about. And then as you're writing your rhetorical analysis essay, still look at like their details and their word choice. So if you're talking about comparison, look at the nuance of the words that they're comparing. That can be a way to improve your score too. Somebody asked earlier how they could get their score from like a 120 to a 130. And I had said, for rhetorical analysis, make sure you're connecting to the message, argument, or purpose, which is very true. You want to make sure you do that, but you also want to make sure that you're examining like the word choice and details too, because that can sometimes help your score. So yeah, at least 2 choices. Some people do 3. My teacher said, I almost got it. What are some points you have? Oh, the sophistication point. I need to remember to like read the questions in order. My bad. Okay. Oh, sophistication point. Okay. So which essay? Because my advice might depend on which essay you're talking about. So if it was rhetorical analysis, the easiest way I think that students, okay, yeah, rhetorical analysis. I think the easiest way for it is when students really connect to the rhetorical situation. So, really thinking about like the nuances of the rhetorical situation. So, think about like speaker audience and any kind of like tensions that they have in that, or think about like the context or the exigence, so like the occasion, like why they're speaking at this particular event or in response to something. So that would be like the first thing is really digging into the rhetorical situation. Um, because I think a lot of times students kind of ignore the speaker audience relationship or they ignore the historical context or they might be really redundant when they're talking about like message and argument and purpose and things like that. So that would be the first thing I would say. If you have a good writing style, work on your word choice. So I usually tell students to start by eliminating lower level words. So we want to get rid of like good, bad, thing, stuff, really, very, those kinds of words. Incorporate more precise wording. Also work on, if you're trying to work on your writing style, work on adding adjectives and adverbs because that makes it more precise. So for example, instead of just saying like the speaker asserts that, asserts is a good verb, right? But if you said like boldly asserts, as long as that's accurate, that's going to be more precise because that tells me a little bit of like the tone and that kind of thing. So if you're working on your style, add in adjectives and adverbs appropriately. Also try to incorporate advanced punctuation. Don't overdo it, but things like colons, I guess I would consider semicolons advanced punctuation, also dashes. So dashes to like offset extra info. That's not going to guarantee you the sophistication point. Like you can't just use a colon and you get it. But the students who can use a colon correctly, in case no one's ever said this, you need to have a complete sentence before a colon. So if you're taking the SAT or the ACT, there's a tip for you as well. But if you can use colons or dashes correctly, it sometimes breaks up your writing because a lot of students don't. So it makes it more engaging. Again, that has to be combined with other things for sophistication. And then the other way for rhetorical analysis is like the tension between, I kind of already said this, but it's like its own thing. It's like, what do they call it? Complexities and tensions. I feel like not all prompts lend itself to that, but if you are familiar with um, the Banneker prompt, where it's Banneker writing to Thomas Jefferson, there's a lot of complexity there and tension there because he's having to basically call Thomas Jefferson a hypocrite, but still be respectful. So the students who actually analyze his word choice and how it's like cordial, but he's still calling him a hypocrite, that could lend itself to sophistication. The Gandhi's letter to Lord Irwin, I think it was 2019 that was on the exam. That one's got some tension and complexities. I would say the Abigail Adams prompt where she's writing to her son has some complexities, but like, I don't feel like every prompt has like the same level of tension. If I were you, what I would do is also go look online for the samples for the last few years that have earned the sophistication point. Because what's going to happen, you're going to need two documents. One is going to be the essays, and one is going to be the scoring commentaries. They no longer put them together. But look at the ones that get the sophistication point, either like a 141 or a 131. And then look at the ones that didn't. Like, look at the ones that get like a 140. Some of my students who are really close to earning the sophistication point, no matter how much I try to talk about it in class and like help them and like even point out stuff in their own writing, like, hey, if you had said this, sometimes the best way to help them has been to show them essays that earned it. And then they were like, oh, okay, because the College Board says like this is what earned it. And then I've had a couple students be like, oh, so I just have to do this. And then like it kind of worked. So those are my tips for sophistication. Even if you don't earn the sophistication point, if you try for those things, it's going to lead to a better quality essay. So my students who really try to look at like the speaker audience relationship, or they try to think about the tensions, even if they don't get the sophistication point, they usually end up writing better commentary. So maybe it brings their essay from like a 130 to a 140, or maybe it was still a 130, but like maybe it like made me really confident it was a 130. So that would be my best advice for sophistication for rhetorical analysis. And I've got a video about sophistication in rhetorical analysis too. I'm probably going to be updating it because it's a couple years old, and some of the tips I want to kind of modify now that I've been teaching it differently in my own classroom. But I do have a video on that in case it helps. But yeah, remember, sophistication has to be consistent throughout the whole thing too. So it's not like you just get to write like one good sentence and like you get the point. But you probably can do that. So yeah, let me see. I think we got one more question. Is it effective to use terminology like juxtaposition instead of contrast? Okay, so personal opinion here. I prefer when students use rhetorically accurate verbs as opposed to nouns. So if you can use contrast as a verb or juxtaposition, just say juxtaposes. So I don't necessarily like to see, like I used to teach, what was it? I used to teach my students anaphora. So if you're not familiar with that, anaphora is when they repeat something at the beginning of the clause. So like a quick example would be like, we came, we saw, we conquered, or something. I no longer I tell my students it's anaphora sometimes, but I'm like I tell them in your paper, don't write anaphora. Just write the writer repeats and then tell me the word. And then tell me why they repeated that word. And then tell me why that word mattered to their audience or why that word is appropriate for that occasion, because that's the commentary. So I tend to recommend that students use rhetorically accurate verbs as opposed to nouns. But there is nothing wrong with saying juxtaposition. You will still get the point. So if we have two thesis statements and one says the writer uses juxtaposition, and then the other one says the writer juxtaposes this and this, those will both get the thesis point. But I prefer the rhetorically accurate verbs. I think it leads to a better quality paper. Whether that truly influences the score or not is hard to say. But I think if the goal is to be a better writer, try to use rhetorically accurate verbs. Sometimes it's hard. And sometimes not everything translates. So juxtaposition to juxtaposes is an easy one. But like my students, my 10th graders read something last week where it had an anecdote. So we talked about how like you can't turn anecdote into a verb, like juxtaposition juxtaposes. But what they could do is I gave them like 3 options. We kind of brainstormed them together, but I said something like recalls a time when, tells a story about, and reminisces on. And so when I wanted them to write about the anecdote, I had them write about using those verbs as opposed to saying uses an anecdote. So sometimes it's an easy fix, but other times you have to kind of like explain what they're doing. There's not like a single verb for it. So yeah, hope that helps. How badly will scores be impacted for mistakes like referring to Jefferson as president in the essay? Okay, that's a great question. We get this every year. Okay, so the answer is it's not supposed to impact it that much. Because they're looking at the quality of your content. Now, if you say he's president in like your thesis and he's really not president, but that's the only time you reference it, it shouldn't affect your essay at all. If in your analysis you start talking about how he's president and because he's president, he does this and Banneker respects him or whatever it is, then I think it might possibly impact your score more. But like, for example, with the Sonia Sotomayor piece from, I guess it was last year, it says in the prompt that she is an appeals court justice or judge. She later became Supreme Court justice. There were students who wrote, because I read some, even my own students when they were writing this prompt, I had to tell them, because I had my 10th graders do it last semester, I had to tell them like, you can call her future Supreme Court justice, that's fine. You can call her appeals court judge, that's fine. But like I had to tell them like, please be very careful about what you're referring to her as, because she was not a Supreme Court justice at the time. So like I told them like, hey, when you're writing your essay, I don't want you to call her like justice, right? But I do want you to analyze the fact that if she's an appeals court judge, like she had a law background and she was speaking to law students. So like if you just like give the wrong title because like that wasn't their title at the time, I don't think that's really going to affect your score. I've had students in like kind of a separate thing, but very similar in like an argument essay, like refer to the wrong person. So like, I don't know if it was supposed to be Kennedy or they wrote Kennedy, but like they were talking about a president and like they put the wrong president, but like the rest of the evidence was fine. And usually we're told to overlook that. And I think the reason why is we are told to reward students for what they do well. So if you make a tiny little blip of a mistake like that, and you say the wrong person's name or you give them the wrong title, like we also have to recognize as teachers that you only had 40 minutes. And like, I probably would make a mistake too if I was writing an essay in 40 minutes. Like, you know, like you're human. It's okay. So that would be my thing is like, I tell my students, like, don't stress. Like a couple years ago, I had a student, what did she say? I don't know what she did, but she said I used the wrong person's name, like in an argument essay. I think she later told me something about Ben Franklin. I don't know if she meant to write about Ben Franklin or she like used Ben Franklin and it was supposed to be somebody else. I think her essay was still fine. I don't know because we only get their composite scores and there's a lot of factors there, but like I told her not to worry about it because what's done is done, you know? So just hope that the quality of the essay carries you through. But like, yeah, kids make mistakes. Would it impact the score if I use rhetorical devices like synecdoche and Kairos? I always forget how to say that one. It won't impact your score, but I would. Okay, so I'm trying to think of how, like, I don't want to misadvise here. I would encourage you to write about it using rhetorically accurate verbs because Kairos is an appeal. Synecdoche, I feel like people talk more about synecdoche in AP Lit, but you could talk about it in Lang. I would encourage you to try to use rhetorically accurate verbs. Is it wrong? No. Like if you use a device instead of a choice, because devices are nouns, choices are verbs, they still grade it. Like you're still fine. So as long as you are analyzing something, I think the bigger issue, as much as I try to advocate for students using rhetorically accurate verbs, when it comes down to it, it really comes down to your commentary. So if you can't think of a way to write it other than saying synecdoche, but like you have plenty to say about it, then go for it, you know, in that moment. But like there's more of a movement for teachers trying to to advocate for rhetorically accurate verbs because it just leads to better writing, like the style, but sometimes the analysis. So I would try to get in the habit of using those rhetorically accurate verbs. But if you can't think of something like a verb and you use a noun instead, it's not automatically going to lower the quality of your paper. We look at your evidence and commentary. So whatever you choose to write about, just make sure you have specific evidence. I recommend short quotes. Paraphrase also works. I like to see short quotes in the essay, at least somewhere in each paragraph, just personal opinion. But make sure you have plenty of commentary. And it shouldn't really matter as much if you use nouns or verbs. So yeah, but if there's lists of rhetorically accurate verbs, if you're like, what are you talking about? They have some. And I have some videos on it too. I have videos about like what is a rhetorical choice. And I have videos about like the common rhetorical choices. But and those are just like an opinion. Like there's just some that I notice more in what I teach than others. If you look up rhetorically accurate verbs, sometimes the lists have like 100 verbs on them and they can be really overwhelming. So what I tell my students to do is to try to focus on like a handful of rhetorically accurate verbs that you know. So like juxtaposition becomes juxtaposes or contrast. Like you don't need all these fancy terminology things, just kind of keep it simple. Because a rhetorically accurate verb could also be saying asserts or argues or contests, justifies. So like focus on the words that you already could use comfortably. The other thing is don't just automatically look for juxtaposition. So I had a student a couple years ago because we had talked about juxtaposition in class so much for whatever reason. And so then I gave him a new passage and I was like, hey, everyone find the choices in it, whatever. And he called me over and he was like, hey, Coach Hall, I don't see any juxtaposition in here. And I was like, okay, like, what do you mean? What's wrong? And he's like, well, every other passage you gave us had juxtaposition. So where is it? And I had to take a moment. Like that was where I, as a teacher, had to step back and be like, oh, okay, I've got to clarify. You don't want to be looking for the juxtaposition. You want to be looking at what are they doing? And if they happen to be contrasting, then great. But like juxtaposition won't be in every passage. That's why when students ask for like a list of the common choices, I try to always give the disclaimer that these are not going to be equally in every passage. Now, the one thing that is pretty much in every passage though, is word choice and tone. So word choice creates tone. So if you are reading a rhetorical analysis passage and you are super confused and you don't know what to talk about, at the very least, talk about their word choice and their tone, because that's at least something. And those two things usually go together. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions on YouTube or TikTok. So if you are watching on TikTok, go ahead and tap your screen a couple times to give this a couple more likes. And if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to hit that thumbs up and follow or subscribe if you like to. But I'm going to be going live each week at 3 p.m. Eastern, so 2 p.m. Central, to answer student questions. So if you think of a question that you didn't get answered today, feel free to come back in next week and I'll answer whatever questions you have as well. How much commentary for each choice? Okay, so I tell my students to do a topic sentence, evidence, commentary times 2, meaning I want to see more commentary than evidence. And then I usually like to see another layer of evidence and commentary in the concluding sentence. So if you're like, I tell my students sometimes to highlight their evidence and commentary for like the classwork that we do in 2 different colors. Whatever color you're highlighting for commentary, I should see more of that color than the evidence, if that makes sense. So we want to see 2 to 4 sentences of commentary for each piece of evidence. 4 is really pushing it though. Like, I'm going to be honest, like most of my students do like 2 sentences, maybe 3. Like it is rare that I see 4 sentences of commentary, especially for a timed essay. But like you want more commentary than evidence. You can put commentary and evidence in the same sentence. If you do that, you should still have another 1 or 2 sentences of commentary though. And a quick tip for commentary is use the word because that will help you continue your thought. So yeah. All right. So I'm going to go ahead, I guess, and like sign out. Thank you all for joining me and asking questions. I really appreciate it. I hope to see you next week for another AP Lang Q&A. And if you're in AP Lang, best of luck this week in class. Thank you.